Hi, everybody. My name is Rory Martirana. I'm a reference and adult services librarian at the Ives branch of the New Haven Free Public Library. This is a really important collaboration for our organization, especially for the adult services departments system-wide. So it's an honor to introduce tonight's program. Libraries are meant to be bastions of egalitarianism and equality, especially now. And we certainly do strive for that at NHFPL. So it's with great honor and pride that I'll let you take it away, Matt.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks everyone for being here. It's great to, I guess I can't say it's great to see you. I wish I could see you, but it's great to be in conversation with you tonight. Let me make a couple thank yous up front. Thanks to our partners at the New Haven Free Public Library, in particular, Rory Martirana, Marian Huggins, Luis Chavez-Bramel, Seth Godfrey, and Isaac Shub. This has been a really important partnership for the Public Humanities at Yale as well. Let me thank my colleague, Karen Rothman, who's worked so hard on this series, and our program administrator, Jake Gagne, who has also worked very hard and who is working even now as we speak. One program note, our next event will be November 9th. That's also a Tuesday, also at 7 o'clock, with our colleague, Elizabeth Hinton, who will speak about her important new book, America on Fire, The Untold History of Police Violence and Black Rebellion Since the 1960s. Tonight, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dan HoSang. Daniel Martinez HoSang took his PhD at USC, and he taught at the University of Oregon before joining the faculty of Yale, where he teaches ethnicity, race and migration, and American studies. He's an activist scholar who's contributed significantly to the Yale Prison Education Initiative and to the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute. He also supports a summer community organizing training program for undergraduates in conjunction with the Alliance for a Just Society, and a research and advocacy project on public reconstruction and organizing campaigns for public goods. Through the Yale New Haven Teachers Institute, he's taught seminars for K through 12 public school teachers on anti-racist curriculum and pedagogy, and he works with teachers and youth across Connecticut on teaching about racism and racial justice through the Anti-Racist Teaching and Learning Collective. He's the author, co-author, or editor of a number of books on race, politics, and justice in the US, including Racial Propositions, Ballot Initiatives in the Making of Post-War California, Producers, Parasites, Patriots, Race and the New Right-Wing Politics of Precarity with Joe Lowndes, and co-editor of Seeing Race Again, Countering Colorblindness Across the Disciplines, Relational Formations of Race, Theory, Method, and Practice, and Racial Formation in the 21st Century. Tonight, we'll be hearing about his most recent book, published just last month, A Wider Type of Freedom, How Struggles for Racial Justice Liberate Everyone. Dan, welcome. It's great to have you here tonight.
Oh, thanks, Matt. I'm just so grateful.
Oh, I think you're muted.
Oh, okay. So grateful for the invitation. Thanks to the library and Rory and Karen and Jake, and really looking forward to the conversation. Thank you, Matt.
Likewise. So Dan and I will be talking for a while, but you can use the Q&A function to submit questions, which we'll get to more probably in the second half, but I'll kind of curate them as we go, as needed. So I want to start kind of broad with this new work of yours. One of your favored metaphors for the wider type of freedom that you're talking about is the difference between fighting for inclusion in a house that's actually on fire versus putting out that fire. And one of the things I love about this book, it's an unusual approach in a certain way, that it's a history of radical and progressive thought across a pretty wide swath of time and also across many different social movements. But it doesn't focus on the thou shalt nots of progressive thought, such as, thou shalt not suppress my vote, thou shalt not brutalize me at a routine traffic stop. But it's more about the thou shalts. What is the positive vision that lies behind these radical movements? I'm wondering how you came to this approach, and what have been some of the surprises or moments of epiphany along the way once you started looking at things this way?
Okay, thanks, Matt. And I'm just also grateful for everyone for joining tonight and being able to have this conversation. I mean, maybe Matt, let's start with that quote about being integrated into a burning house, which is not mine. It's Dr. King says this to his friend and confidant, the actor Harry Belafonte, in 1967, just a few months before his death. He says, I fear I'm integrating my people into a burning house. And I think this is important for us to think about because, the country had just passed a whole set of landmark civil rights initiatives that were intended to guarantee access to education and housing and outlaw discrimination and employment. And, I think across this time, the last couple of years, he's engaged in tracing all of these relationships. He's coming to terms with this kind of deep-seated militarism that is so core to the country, the relationship then between that militarism and an economy that constantly needs to find new places and new groups of workers to hire and to exploit. And so he says to Belafonte, here's the problem, we can't sit and watch it burn. And we can't rush into the burning house. We have to find a way to reconstruct it, to redo it. And I don't think he meant in a kind of Wizard of Oz, I'm going to close my eyes and just imagine another kind of place, where sometimes we're saying we're just going to imagine otherwise. I mean, he really meant we have to think very carefully about the sets of relationships that we're being incorporated into, that we're being invited into, and what it would take to restructure those so that everyone might have a greater possibility of life and dignity, et cetera. And I think what surprised me was how recurrent that idea has been across so many of these struggles. We often think about them today as that was a fight because they too wanted to, they wanted to show they were equal. They too wanted a seat at the table. They wanted integration into these systems. But there was some recurring sense that, it's I can see how these institutions harm us, who's in the facing the struggle, but I can see actually how they harm a lot of people. And I don't want it for myself, but I also don't want it for anyone else. I don't want to just displace the terms of the subordination onto someone else. I don't want to, right? That's not how I understand what freedom is. And so I think that's partly what really stood out, is because it's not an easy thing to think about. How do I reimagine these sets of relationships I'm in? So not only does it not harm me, but it doesn't harm other people. And what would it take to invite people in to reimagine those possibilities for everyone?
What's your understanding of why it is that this has had to be a recurring idea? It never, it doesn't take root in a certain kind of way, in at least it kind of in popular discourse. It's an idea that has to be reborn in each movement, and it's not exactly a tradition, even if it's a recurring idea.
Yeah, it's such a great question. I mean, I think that, this is what I think about that. I think that when faced with forms of exclusion and violence and humiliation, if you're trying to figure out how does that not happen to me, and you think about the systems that are doing it, whether it's policing and prisons or schooling or education, you do actually think about well, how can I sidestep this so that it doesn't rain on me? Part of how our kind of liberal market democracy works is that there are possibilities for that. You can get incorporated and escape from some of the worst parts of this. But part of what the artists and the groups that I'm trying to I'm learning from here are saying is that's just kind of shifting it onto someone else. And eventually that you're not going to be able to escape from. And I think that's the realization King came to realize. There's actually no way for all of us to be whole and safe and protected under the kind of current configurations of power. And I'll just leave it Frantz Fanon, a lot of this came out of these decolonial thinkers around the middle of the 20th century. Fanon in Wretched of the Earth, has this great line. He says if we're just trying to make a mirror copy of what Europe has done through colonialism, let's leave it to them. They will know how to do that better than we will. They're good at it, if that's there. He said, so our charge has to be something else, right? And I just want to say again, not in just a kind of utopian sense, in a sense of like, how would schooling work? How would we think about the interdependence and relationship of our bodies and our health? How would we think about what governance is like, what labor is like? So practical questions that allow us to reimagine new possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, I think that I ended up in a really similar place in my understanding of race and citizenship in the US, and thinking about what in the late 18th century was that really tight circle of who we the people were, like who was imagined by that phrase. And the choice that it left for people on the outside was this choice between kind of making the case, we belong with we the people because we're just like you, the kind of assimilationist argument, or the Du Boisian argument, we aren't just like you, but you're wrong about the hierarchy part, and the difference we bring will be a gift to the Republic. And as different as those positions are, they actually both leave completely intact the core principle that there's an inside and an outside, and then one has to be fit to kind of be welcomed in. And it seems like you're spotting a kind of a broader version of that same kind of structural dynamic, where the structures that are in place make it very hard to see the alternatives.
Yeah, I mean, I think citizenship, Matt, and certainly all of your work on this is a place where we can see this in really stark terms, right? Where it's absolutely true that to move from the non-citizen to the citizen confers all these benefits, right? It protects you from some kinds of harm. It's not something illusory. And so it makes sense then that if you're in the category of the non-citizen, that you would direct your energies to what does it mean to get citizenship, so I might be protected from it. And yet, you know, and there's a part of this in the book, a whole body of work that said, well, why should citizenship be the condition for any of us to have a life worth living? What would it take to reject that as the terms of our protection and safety? And again, not as in a utopian, but in a very kind of practical way. So I think that's, you know, like that citizenship absolutely helps us see it. And, you know, just maybe one more thing on King. You know, when King said this is a world in crisis in the 60s, I mean, maybe that was refracted through some of the social movements and culture, but this was the high point of the post-war US economy. I mean, many people would say that's ridiculous, right? That is not an honest accounting of what our world is like. This is a good world that makes people safe, and we know we can make some adjustments. You know, today, looking back on it, I think many more people agree, like, this is a world in crisis. We can think in terms of the environment. We can think in terms of this constant speed up we're in, the sense that, like, no matter what we do, it's hard to get ahead. So, and I just want to point out, I don't think it's not a coincidence that it's King and others who are having these insights before the kind of general population and before most of white America sees that actually what they thought to be the safety and protection of these institutions is more precarious and deadly than they might have imagined.
You've mentioned King and you've mentioned Fanon. Before, I want to kind of walk through the architecture of your book, because I think it's a really interesting way of thinking about these problems. But before we get to that, can you just say a little bit more about your cast of characters? Because it's really broad and really diverse and really interesting. Who are some of the figures that really, you know, flared your own imagination as you started to think about these big questions?
Yeah, I mean, it was a great chance for me to learn. I feel like, you know, we have this way, Matt, of learning about like social movements or social movement heroes. You know how like Google has those Google Doodles, so every once in a while they'll replace their logo with like Rosa Parks, and then more recently with other kind of lesser known names. And you don't really know much about them. You just know that they stood up, right? They were a heroine or a hero. And so what I was really trying to do here was not just look at, you know, this is a person that resisted and defied and stood up for, you know, their dignity, but actually people who are trying to make sense of what was around them, again, and the particular sets of violences and that they were facing, again, to try to reimagine something new for everyone. So that was like kind of what I was always looking for. The book is divided into these 4 chapters on the body, on governance and democracy, and on labor, and on internationalism and militarism. And part of what I'm trying to argue is that in each of those categories, these are formations that are not just, again, saying, hey, how can I find a way into it, you know, so that my body doesn't become the site of violence. But part of what they're saying is like the whole way we're thinking about the body, that some people's bodies are disposable, that we can disavow them, that bodies exist in this hierarchy of superiority to degradation that has such a long history. It's a long history in the academy. They're saying like, that's infantile. That's not how we have to think about our interrelationship. There's ways for us to think about the body that aren't rooted in such assumptions about degradation. So I was really drawn to places where their origins were actually so much different, right? You don't need to live safely in a world strictly through a militaristic orientation. There's other ways to imagine safety and well-being. So that's part of what I was kind of like looking for and what drew my attention to these different episodes.
And then, so who are some of the figures who emerge in that kind of conversation, who might be easily missed if you conceptualize the conversation differently?
Yeah, so let's just start, in the kind of chapter on the body. So this is a well-known story, at least, in feminist historians around resisting sexual violence and incarceration. But there was a woman named Joan Little in the 1970s in North Carolina who was jailed, and she was like constantly surveilled, jailed. Her jailer assaulted her, tried to sexually assault her. And she grabbed his, I think an ice pick maybe that she had there, and she defended herself and freed herself, and she escaped. And when she actually returned and said, like, I'm gonna face this, and a whole burgeoning movement of feminists, reproductive rights organizers, this huge group actually converged on Joan, on her case, and said, like, all these ways we've been thinking about the body are to imagine that like someone is bad, right? Like someone is disposable, you've done something bad, you're to be like distanced. And they flipped that. They all said like Joanne Little could be you, she could be me, she could be any of us. And so I thought it was such a different way of thinking about, again, those like hierarchies of degradation. And, and I'll just say this last thing, where I came across this was, there's this amazing mural in San Diego, a set of murals, Chicano Park. It's like all these amazing muralists. And most of the figures there's dozens of murals under this freeway, are indigenous or Chicano or Mexicano figures. On one pillar, there's a pillar of Joan Little and this poem that she read. And I looked into its history, and it turns out it's these women in this group called the Chicana Royal Air Force who made this mural because they were inspired by her work and this movement at the time. So I was so struck that like even 3,000 miles away, they recognized in Little's trial something that was at stake for them, and the same way that they were thinking about what it would take to protect them from these kinds of violences. So it goes from there to women fighting against sterilization abuse, all, I'm kind of arguing, linked by a shared way of understanding the interdependence of bodies.
Can you say a bit about how these four categories, body, governance, internationalism, and labor, emerged for you out of this, I mean, really kind of chaotic set of kind of, in some ways, interlocking or sometimes overlapping histories, but sometimes quite distinct and separate histories, and histories that span, decades, if not centuries. How did you, this is not a critique, your categories work, but I'm just curious kind of how these emerged for you as the places to focus your attention.
Yeah, I think, just a couple of things. Part of it is that we tend to have, I think, we're often going to have a pretty flat understanding of what racism and prejudice is, that it's animus, it's kind of just a belief in inferiority or superiority, without actually thinking about the very particular systems through which it works. So, there's the chapter on labor, for example, thinks about how race is so fundamental to incentivizing people to constantly be in competition with one another, for fear both that they'll be left behind, that they'll be humiliated, that someone else will get something at their expense. So the kind of, and many others have written about this, the contemporary system of labor management is deeply dependent on racial difference. The same thing is true with our system of militarization and the way we think about, gathering armaments and armies, the way we think about governance, like who's worthy to be participating and who's not, right? Who do we have to make sure doesn't show up? And again, to the body. So these are all sites where race does such important, but sometimes hidden work. And so again, part of the kind of like, what I was, trying to learn from these sites is what does it mean for anti-racism and racial justice to reimagine how labor might work, or to reimagine kinds of internationalism. So it's, I think what they're doing is calling our attention to how, at these sites, at the site of the aircraft carrier or the military base or the factory in Detroit or the hospital ward in LA, race is actually reproducing these unequal relations, and these are sites where people are trying to think about something else.
We have a question that came in from an anonymous attendee, and it fits with what you were just speaking of. So let's go to this. And I want to encourage people to submit questions and comments. The question is, what are the ways, the other ways to feel safe other than the army? And this goes to, King's critique of militarism. It goes to your critique of militarism. It goes to some of the things you were just saying. Can you talk a little bit about internationalism, I guess, both as kind of white supremacist systems and global capital on the one hand, but also transnational alliances on the other, and kind of how you've thought of internationalism and militarism and anti-militarism as being so important to these struggles?
Yeah, I think this is, again, the long history of these social movements in the US that said, we certainly get it through King, but through others that said, these are largely wars in which poor people and people of color within the US are asked to go abroad and shoot at and harm and violate poor people in other places. And that those poor people were not the source of people's vulnerability and what, limited their lives, that actually there were connections and possibilities between them. And that these were not wars that had anything really to do with safety, and that what would make people safe is to think about how, rather than devoting all of these resources and all this time and life, right, into militarization, we might redirect them towards other places. So, I think it's just been a recurring sense. And so, I write at different points about forms of Black anti-militarism from the 1890s, where when, the US invaded the Philippines, Hawaii, Cuba, Puerto Rico, there were these really important voices in the Black press that said, like, we recognize what's happening here. We know when you're saying this is a fight for freedom and we should go to the Philippines, we see what's happening there. It bears a lot of resemblance. It's not the same, but it bears enormous resemblance to Jim Crow here, to what's happening in Cuba, to what's happening in Hawaii. I was just blown away. It's such sophisticated work to say these places are all linked together in some ways. And that, again, there's no freedom waiting for us there, right? Or the freedom that's promised to us through service is not really freedom. And so you have, through into the 1960s, the National Black draft resistors actually going to induction sites and talking to young men who were about to, be inducted, to say, well, what are the other possibilities we have? Why, how do we turn ourselves away from war to other kinds of things? So I think that's different from just kind of saying, like, I believe in peace and not war. It's actually linking people's experiences of oppression within the US to what was happening in other parts, to think beyond the national frame. So to the question about what might make us safe is not to just be so consumed that, with a kind of militarized nationalism and imagine other possibilities.
For my generation, I'm not that much older than you, but I am a little bit older than you. When I went to grad school, it was just kind of, my mentors were kind of the New Left generation, and I was like just a 0.5 generation behind them. And there was this really sharp turn, away from older schools of thought about what history even is. Like, it's not presidents and wars. It's, it's social history. It's history from the bottom up. It's women's history. It's Black studies. It's ethnic studies, which is a incredible kind of change, a sea change in what was regarded as an object of study and a topic for inquiry. But one of the ironies was that when these new histories were told, it turned out that wars were actually the most important inflection points in narrating them. Like if you're narrating the African American liberation struggle in the U.S., you know from the Civil War to the Philippine American War to World War I to World War II to Vietnam to Iraq is like not a bad skeleton to start with. Can you talk a little bit about your own understanding of kind of how to think in periods across time, and how to make the past most usable to us now in this moment of crisis, as you said, on so many fronts? How do we mobilize our understanding of the past for this?
Well, you know, Matt, maybe there's one thing we could listen to together that might help illustrate this, because I think there is a way, which is just a very short poem I might play for us that I talk about and learn from in the book from the poet June Jordan. And I'll just set the stage for a second. I'll play the poem and then talk about it in response to your question, if that's all right. So let's try.
Yeah.
Oops. So this is 1973. This is Nixon's second inauguration. Just, you know, the very quick background is that there had been growing pressure and protests for the US to withdraw from Vietnam. In increasing sense, it was a debacle. Nixon, they had hinted that was possible, but then actually that December had launched this terrible, terrible offensive. And then, as I suggested, this kind of growing presence that linked civil rights and racial justice to ending the war in Vietnam was growing more pronounced. And the picture we're looking at here is a singer. She wasn't like terribly famous. She was a jazz singer named Ethel Innes. She was from Baltimore, which was Spiro Agnew's hometown, the vice president. So he invited her to sing the national anthem at Nixon's inauguration. And it was, you know, somewhat significant in that this wasn't a military band doing it. She kind of gave it a jazz inflection in her phrasing. She was herself not an ideologue. She was a registered Democrat, and said, look, I just want to sing to the world. And you could understand why it would be such a kind of potent and attractive opportunity for her. And this is a photo of just the anti-war demonstrations outside. So June Jordan, you know, records this wonderful poem, and it's titled "Poem to My Sister Ethel Ennis," who sang the Star-Spangled Banner at the second inauguration of Richard Milhous Nixon, January 20th, 1973. And you'll hear in just these couple of minutes the way Jordan addresses Ennis as her sister, and tries to make visible what she's being conscripted into, the set of relations and violences that she's being conscripted into, and appealing to her. And so I want to say this is I'll just say this, you know, quickly. I think another way for us to talk about the impact of wars, the way we narrate and remember them, and to think about possibilities beyond the kind of top down, right? What were the national interests at stake? At what time did troops move, et cetera? The kind of state-centered narrative. This is another kind of narrative. So maybe can we just listen to this for a minute or two? Okay, great.
Yeah, please.
Poem to my sister Ethel Ennis, who sang the Star-Spangled Banner at the second inauguration of Richard Milhous Nixon, January 20th, 1973. Gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. On this 47th inauguration of the Killer King, my sister, what is this song you have chosen to sing? And the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, my sister, what is your song to a flag? To the 12 days of Christmas, bombing when the homicidal holiday shit tore forth, pouring from the B-52 bowels loose over Hanoi. And the skin and the agonized, the blown limbs, the blinded eyes, the silence of the children dead on the street, and the incinerated homes in Bach Mai Hospital blasted and drowned by the military, the American shit bomber dropping down death and burying the lives, the people of the new burial ground under the flag. For the second coronation of the Killer King, what is this song you have chosen to sing? My sister, When will it come finally clear? In the rocket's red glare, my sister, after the ceremonial guns salute the ceremonial rifles, saluting the ceremonial cannons that burst forth, a choking smoke to celebrate murder in that red, that bloody red glare, my sister, that glare of murder and atrocity, atrocities of power, strangling every program to protect and feed and educate and heal and house the people, talking about us, you and me talking about us. When will it be clear to you? Which night will curse out the stars with the blood of the flag for you, for enough of us? By the rocket's red glare, when will it be clear that the flag, that this flag is still there, is still here, and will smother you, smother your songs? Can you see, my sister? Is the night and the red glaring blood clear at last? Can you see, my sister? Say you can see, my sister, and sing no more of war.
So I think there's just a number of things. I mean, I think I find it to be a kind of like just moving piece, and you can sense Jordan's own, right? Like, the kind of, but the way she appeals to Ennis, right? To help to kind of like reveal what was at stake and what was being smothered, and just I'll say, like that notion of like, can't you see what we're being asked to do? Is not, it's something, she renders with brilliant insight, but you can see the same argument in 1898. You can see it for Hawaiian sovereignty activists pointing out, where the military in places like Honolulu is such an important source of employment and economic development, and folks trying to work, beyond that. You can see it in Vieques, Puerto Rico, to what would it mean to reimagine life there outside the military. And it's not just a kind of like, I don't know, I just want to say like just kind of a, say no to war, because partly they understand the seductions, right? That war and militarism, how central it is to our country, to all of us, right? How it kind of pulls on our allegiances. So if we're to undo and extricate ourselves from, this like heavy militarized like approach to the world, you can't just hold up a sign that says no war. You have to think about what are the relations that are pulling people in, and how do you interrupt them and orient people's energies towards different possibilities. And I feel like in this short sense, that's partly what Jordan is, in some ways kind of modeling for everyone.
Yeah. And I guess, I mean, the spirit of my question, I guess, was just how exhausting it is, because there's always another war, and it's always premised on another set of promises that we know are hollow. And it is, I mean, as you said, it's a core feature of our political culture and our national life. And it's hard to figure out, like, all of the just kind of brilliant critique that is available to us. I think of C.L.R. James during World War II, or some of the critics that you were talking about during the Philippine-American War. I mean, the critics are always there and they're always brilliant, but they always have to do that work again, because the state is just rolling on. And I don't know how to turn that into a question, but it's your book comes across, actually, I won't say it's optimistic, but it is a very hopeful book. And I wonder how you find yourself kind of thinking about those kinds of questions.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like partly I'm following, what I'm seeing there. Like, I'll just say this. There's another story. The wonderful organizer Petita Martinez, who recently passed away, Chicana, kind of came up with SNCC in the 1960s, went to do all this amazing organizing in the Southwest, and she was at an anti-war. This is important with Colin Powell's passing, but she was at an anti-war march in 2001, and she recalls leading a chant in San Francisco, 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your racist war. And actually the crowd was, this is in liberal San Francisco, very ambivalent, because they understood, well, it's a war for profits and oil. It has nothing to do with racism or racism at home. And I say that because, she felt like deeply isolated when that happened. You can imagine she has a bullhorn and, into this crowd, and they're silent. And then she says, this Panther came up to me, former Panther, afterwards, and she said, oh, that was worse. When we were speaking out against, or the war in the 60s, we were just attacked. So I'm just, drawn to people who are, they're seeing this. They're saying, like, present these, militarized relations and all of the resources going into it and the death and harm it causes, there's no possibility or hope for any of us. So, so it's less about kind of, right, like, is this going to win? Is this, and more like there's an urgent necessity for us to kind of press this claim forward, and the hope that it might kind of like spread and we can win, and secure something that could be the anchor for new kinds of possibilities. So that's partly what I'm, in spite maybe of those rollbacks and knowing how formidable, right, these kind of machines are, to still be able to say, like, we can't imagine this is inevitable, because once we do, there's, like, we kind of have no hope.
Right. We can't afford fatalism, but it's, we have to work hard to avoid it. Here's another question that came in. Maybe you just partially answered it just now, but I'm going to ask it anyway. You might want to elaborate. How do people like Ethel come together to create change?
I mean, I think what I was just struck by with Jordan is, like, so Jordan doesn't imagine Innes as, like, maybe in some, like, terms today, like, she's not just calling her out and just saying, you've sold out, you're morally stained, right? She's saying, look what you're being drawn into. But obviously, in addressing her as her sister, she still imagines, like, there's other things we can do. And so, when writing about anti-militarism efforts, or, learning from, again, in Puerto Rico and Hawaii, in other places, you constantly see that. You see appeals like, I understand we all might be pulled into this direction and there might be something there, but I also am holding out a possibility for us that our well-being won't just be secured through, a military service in this way. So I guess I think there's something there about, like, not imagining these questions as just ethical and moral ones, but taking seriously, there are powerful forces that are constantly trying to incorporate us into it, and accepting that, and that appealing and offering, again, other kinds of possibilities. So I just want to, like, say that to say, like, I think that's a different way than I often hear people address one another, right? If they're like, if you're on the wrong side, like, how could you? You just betrayed me, right? It's a personal thing to say, look, all of us can get seduced and incorporated for lots of different reasons in these processes.
Right. Right. Well, that's the history of the left writ large, right? Is that we're gonna fight to the death over the quarter of an inch that separates us, right?
Yeah, and I just think there's just a way you can hear it in Jordan's language to say, like, like, I understand what's gotten you here, but I think there's a way for all of us to imagine something else.
Yeah. Two sections that we haven't dealt with as elaborately as the other two are the governance section and the labor section. Do you want to just kind of give us kind of what are the important things that I don't want to say the important things that you said. I want to say the important things that you learned from that part of your inquiry, or those parts of your inquiry.
Yeah, let me just read something just so I get the quote right. So this is from Du Bois, writing in 1919 in this great essay. I'll say a little bit more about it, but Du Bois says, democracy is a method of doing the impossible. It is the only method yet discovered of making the education and development of all men, all people, a matter of all people's desperate desire. Making everyone's education and development a matter of everyone else's desperate desire. And that's the definition, that's his definition of democracy. And so part of what I want to, like, say there is, he doesn't understand it as just, this in a very thin, like, every 3 years I go in and cast a vote. He's saying we would actually be so profoundly, desperately invested in one another's development. That's what democracy is. And I don't want to just say that as a pie in the sky thing. I mean, there's some ways in which libraries and schooling and other kinds of institutions are about that, right? They're about, we'll submit, and contribute some of our labor, some of our taxes, because we are, invested deeply in other people's development. So I just want to say that is a vision for democracy. It so far exceeds what we often think of as governance in this country. So that chapter on governance really builds on that. It talks about Ella Baker in the 1960s, the great trainer, in the midst of a voter registration drive, saying, when everyone was about to celebrate, like, this is it, voting rights have been won. She's like, this is just the beginning. The right to vote that is not really what it means to govern our lives together. We have to think about what we're going to eat. We need to think about our schools, the education we're going to get. It's a much wider vision of governance than she's saying, this is a kind of such a diminished form of it. To students organizing in Arizona, undocumented students who sat down in the street 10 years ago and said, we are not going to play this game anymore of just, like you give us citizenship and we disavow everyone else. We're claiming everyone, right? All of us together as a sense of governance. So that's what that chapter does about governance, a way about having sovereignty and shape over our lives that's in an interdependent, and again, far exceeds again, what I think is a very limited way we think about governance. And I think, like, what would it mean if, like, in our textbooks, we start with Du Bois's quote about governance and democracy, or we start with Ella Baker, talking about governance means schools and food and other things, versus like just reading formally the amendments to the Constitution. And then the chapter on labor is also about some sense that workers at different points have had about, like, all we're constantly often to do is to compete against one another so that the worst forms of exploitation come onto someone else and not us. And so I was really just moved by workers and labor thinkers who are trying to think, like, this is not going to end. I write a lot about James Boggs, a radical thinker in Detroit in the 1960s, who works in these huge auto mills in Detroit. And he's like, these machines are always going to be able to outwork us. So we're left with these very limited choices: racing to keep up with the machine, or being abandoned by the machine and just being hungry outside. And this is not going to end good for any of us. And again, at that time, it just was not like something, it's like, no, of course, don't you want a job at GM? That's what, like, living the good life is. I feel like now, with our kind of like, contingent Amazon economy of constant speed ups, that account really makes sense, right? Like, we're just being worked and competed against one another to death. And so it's stories of how workers have tried to think about a form of well-being that's not just involved in trying to kind of win the latest round of competition.
Right. And it cycles right back into the section on the body, because it gets to the question of disposability and the many ways that factors in this society. And I think that's one of the most shocking things about the crisis that we're in right now. I think the pandemic has just laid bare so much of this. The casual way that the right, I would say the society in general, but especially the right, the casual way that the right has greeted the death of 700,000 plus members of ours. I mean, it's shocking and chilling. To go back to Boggs, I mean, this does not end well. If disposability has reached this scale that I don't even know how to get my mind around it, but it does bring me to, I want to kind of think through with you, or think alongside you, about the relationship between your book and the really rich visions of justice that it embodies on the one hand, and our current crisis on the other. Because I do feel like electoral politics is taking all the oxygen, and for understandable reasons. We can't afford to turn away from it just now, because the disaster will ensue if we do. But on the other hand, it's clear that electoral politics can never deliver what we need when it comes to our most pressing problems. And I wonder how you think about, or how your research has taught you to think about, the most effective way in to make meaningful change in our political culture and our lives together.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a big question. I'll maybe try to get it, to the side. I mean, one is, I actually don't think it's just partisan. I mean, I think there's simply a way that, like, disposability, King used the word thingification, right? Mm-hmm. When a person becomes a thing, which he absolutely traced to slavery and enslavement and genocide, but when a person becomes a thing, and I talk about this a little in the labor chapter, like, workers constantly saying, like, I feel like a thing, right? And we can hear that in the accounts of working inside, like an Amazon warehouse, like when the body gets turned into a thing. So I think I actually don't think this is going to come from, like, this is what I've been thinking about lately, is the way that so many hundreds of thousands of workers are just abandoning low-wage work. They're just refusing it, right? And, for the longest time, I mean, even, to like 10 years ago, there's this notion, it's like, well, work in and of itself has value, right? Like simply laboring for a wage has intrinsic reward. And that's the kind of mythology, right? That just keeps everyone showing up day after day. So it's remarkable to me that hundreds of thousands of people, millions perhaps, are saying, I don't think so. I don't see why a certain kind of suffering and humiliation and degradation is like core to my life. And I'm not sure what else exists out there outside it, but I'm not going to just accept that proposition on its own. And Boggs said that. He said, we can't think of work as just something in and of itself. We should think about what we want the technology to do for us so that work becomes something that we have control over. So that's what I'm partly like drawn towards in that sense, is like more of these like everyday actions where people are refusing a certain kind of proposition that's in front of them. You could argue it's true for militarism as well, in that like there's a way in which all the US military is it's been so pushed out of our consciousness, right? We have this military footprint, but it's almost not in any, parts of the media we, consume. Right. Part because, people have a hard time bearing it, I think, right? Bearing what it means to be, incorporated into this. So that's where I see some kind of possibilities.
Right. No, and that kind of enforced forgetting is so powerful and so important to the military machine. I mean, I think that if the US hadn't withdrawn from Afghanistan, many Americans would have totally forgotten that we were there in the first place, and had forgotten. And I think that kind of constant renewal of national innocence is one of the most insidious and important kind of elements of our imperialist culture. And I guess, where I guess I find myself going with this then is all of the work that you've done around pedagogy and anti-racist work, not just in the classroom, but in many, many different settings, many different kinds of settings, but just kind of alerting people to different ways of thinking. Can you talk a little bit about your own kind of activist scholarship and how it fits in with your scholarship?
Yeah, I mean, I think just to that really important question about education and curriculum and pedagogy, and this is something I've learned from, all these K through 12 teachers I've had an opportunity to work with, is like, schooling is such a central site in terms of shaping the kinds of subjects that we are, right? Whether we understand militarism as inevitable, whether we think about the nation as, exceptional, who we care about, who we don't care about. But, for a long time, these movements also thought about education as not just, training to get a credential and some skills, but a place where you can collectively encounter new experiences, become new kinds of people. And I would say this is education in the broadest sense, not just in the classroom, but also what folks learn in the union hall and on the bus to a demonstration and reading, the account of an activist. So, in the last chapter, I really talk about, it's actually James Boggs' longtime partner, Grace Lee Boggs, who says, we are just not yet the people we need to be. In other words, we're so socialized to be so profoundly, individualistic, to believe that markets are the only way, to believe that guns actually do make us safe. We have to, if that's our default, there really is, it's going to be very difficult to imagine new possibilities. So that's where I think shifts in how we think about schooling and education and how we collectively learn from one another are so important to, imagine like the new kinds of people we might be able to be. Because and that's where it's important, not as a kind of, I don't know, like self-shaming thing, but as like all of us have work and growth to do if we're to be able to make these kinds of contributions. And that we shouldn't expect it, that just because we yearn individually for justice, that we have all the resources we need.
We have just a few minutes left. Feel free to submit some questions. Here's one that just came in. This goes back like a few, maybe one or two comments ago. Bringing the topic of the pandemic and wages. How could this change life for the best?
Yeah, I mean, I think this, like, look, with this kind of just somewhat spontaneous but collective and clearly, right, like potent withdrawal of labor is actually starting to tip some balances, right? So there's new conversations about, you know, both supports for people who choose to stay home, about limiting the work week, et cetera. So I think the insight that I get from learning from these, you know, sites is like, what would it mean now to just like to reimagine how work could work in a period when technology does so many of the functions. And this is what Boggs constantly said. He said, like, he's not a Luddite. He's like, these machines are kind of amazing and they're doing all this work. But the problem is, again, we can't keep up, and that our relationship to them is just one of kind of exploitation. So I think now, and I'm not saying this is something that like gets put in a policy brief in the next month or two, but there does seem to be this opening to think about what, you know, work looks like that actually makes technology be work more dignified, less degrading, and more secure for everyone. And, you know, there's many people, and I would say the same thing about, you know, healthcare and this crisis on the body, and this notion of like a very highly expensive medical treatment system that kind of isolates everyone from one another, that tends not to think about the social context of health, of medicine and well-being, that this was also a time when we could revisit those things, that medicine isn't just a clinical undertaking. So I think there's lots of sites where we can use these openings to reimagine these new possibilities.
Mm-hmm. Here's another question that just came in. I am from the Czech Republic, and when I came to New Haven 2 months ago, I was horrified by the lack of awareness of climate change and the amount of wasting. When I asked around, people told me that there are so many fights on so many levels in the US that people cannot distinguish climate change as the crucial topic. What is your take on that? Thank you.
I mean, so it's interesting because if we think that's such a good question, if we think about it from like the pollster side, like, do you think climate change is a threat or not? We'll get the kind of typical divide. But you can also sense this just brewing uneasiness and sense of vulnerability and panic that cut across many places that I think is actually quite localized, that you're not going to just be able to pick up in terms of an attitude towards it. I just think this is partly where our social movements need to direct themselves to these local places to think about what it means to both, like, what the crisis is that we're facing locally and how that connects to many other places. So I guess that's part of how I answer the question is, it's not like, I think we often think about it as how do we convince people that the science of climate change is true so that they will change and become a different kind of person. And I guess I'm saying there's another way to do it, which is what moves people where they're at now, right? For their own well-being, for the people around them. And how might we connect that to another kind of vision for what like justice and safety around the climate is. But I think that is where we're tied in knots when we just think of it as like, let me show you this graph that, you know, depicts warming in a more direct way.
Right. Here's another question. When a person becomes a thing sums up so much. Thank you for that, Jem. In my household, we discuss consumption of bodies, often related to sports and football in particular, which only became more pronounced during the beginning of the pandemic when there was a push to risk the health of athletes for the entertainment and profit of others. This doesn't discount the value of athletics that it has for its participants, et cetera, but thinking about any children in your life, what would you hope to see in their sports teams that builds up the value of their bodies?
Yeah, I mean, this is another area for, I think we're trying to think about like new possibilities, like a kind of new generalized consciousness about the everyday ways that, you know, these very everyday ways that people's bodies had long been stigmatized, degraded, ashamed, and humiliated, and much more awareness about that we, you know, like, no one wants to experience that, and we have obligations not to reproduce that on others. I think sports is this very interesting place you see it. And, you know, I both write and teach about sports, in that it, on the one hand, has this kind of win at all costs notion, even in the level of youth sports, like we have to just experience winning for its own sake, right? And that exists right next to all these sense of like thinking about like fairness and connections and obligations to other people. So for me, that question is like, we can just often think of this as like, we're just in this winner take all society and everyone is governed by that ideology. And it's like, people can keep multiple and contradictory ideas. You know, they can think both about competition and also about their care and regard for other people. And that, you know, part of what we have to do is how do we build out the care and regard part of that equation?
This may be the last question, we'll see. School textbooks are often especially poor with respect to the topics and approaches you're discussing. How have the school teachers you've worked with combated this resource failure, and what is the best way to change textbook content and publishing?
Yeah, that's such an important question. I'll just say quickly, I mean, we have a teacher who was just awarded National History Teacher of the Year in New Haven, Natalia Berginski. And what I've learned from her is, and actually really speaks to a wider type of freedom. So she has these wonderful project-based assignments where her students help to create these maps, these kind of people's history maps of New Haven, Black, Indigenous, Latinx histories, where they talk about sites of domination, but sites of resistance, community formation, et cetera. So for them, they don't think history is something that comes from a textbook, a set of facts you memorize and then repeat back to the instructor. They think history is, I think, how we think of it. It's acts of interpretation. It's all around us. It bears on our lives. We can have a role in using it and thinking with it to reimagine new kinds of futures. So, and that I think is not just, well, that's like the textbook version of history is kind of good for the white suburban student, but for these students, they need another kind. The white suburban students are also poorly served by memorizing rote facts that they're largely ambivalent about and repeating them back. And so it's not surprising to me that you have in multiracial New Haven, you know, teachers who, responding to the needs of their students, are saying, like, let's reimagine how we do historical work together in this class as collaborative, as public facing, as something we get excited about. So what I appreciate about that is they're not going to tussle with the textbook. They're going to say, we want this class to exceed anything else that it might have, you know, been imagined. And I think that's a kind of good model for us, right? It's like, how do we not just figure out how to comport ourselves to the existing paradigm or push back against its worst excesses, but reimagine it so it offers new possibilities for many, many people.
One last question. So your more recent book, not the most recent, but the one before, your book with Joe Lowndes, you talk a lot about precarity. And one of the things that's really powerful about that book is that you think about how, well, we want to say, as both of us have said in the last hour, that precarity can offer a kind of opportunity for a different kind of collective thinking. As you've shown, it can also turn into the opposite. Precarity and the way it becomes a political tool in some people's hands, the way it becomes a kind of identity marker of hatred in other people's hands. How do you think about precarity as it's kind of scarring our political landscape right now, and what do you regard as maybe the surest way out of some of the traps that precarity has actually laid for us?
Yeah, I mean, thanks for that. That's the last question. I mean, look, precarity has been, right, a recurrent foundational condition for so many people in this country, right? People who were enslaved, people whose like lands and lives were taken, migrants who were only valued for the labor they could contribute. So I think there's a long body of work of people that, you know, they didn't presume there was anything for them but precarity. And they saw how that uncertainty and those, you know, violences were shaping their lives. And again, as we've talked about, not to thinking like, how do I escape the precarity and join, you know, like become the person enacting the precarity in other people. So I think there's just so many, I mean, I feel like what I tried to draw from this book are the tip of the iceberg of people who have, again, long thought about that, you know, and tried to, that you're not gonna, addressing precarity on an individual basis, right? Whether it means just trying to get a different kind of degree for myself or trying to move around, will always have limited. And it is always just trying to escape the kind of worst of the humiliation for yourself. And these collective projects have thought about, like, that's not really what's going to deliver us from it. Now, I'm not suggesting it's like an automatic prescription, but I guess I am saying these individuated approaches to dealing with uncertainty and precarity are always limited. And if we want to think about where other ways of approaching it might be, we have a rich genealogy of doing that, of thinking beyond individual approaches to precarity. And I'll just share this last great story by Vincent Harding. He's a wonderful, he's all in the book, and he said, I heard a commercial about water quality, and I thought, oh, like, what is this about? It's about us collectively getting to our water. And it was about buying an individual filter to, get your water fixed. And he said, like, this is what we're conditioned to do, to take a collective problem and individuate it. So he's saying we have to do the opposite, look past the individual proposition you're given to what might collectively make everyone less vulnerable.
Dan HoSang, thank you so much. Thank you for your time tonight. Thanks for sharing your ideas with us. Thanks for the book. This is a book that we all really need right now. So I'm really happy that that you did this work for us, and especially that it came out now of all times, because this is these are tough times, and we need these kinds of visions to sustain us, and also to help us think anew about these stubborn problems. So thanks, everybody. Thanks for coming. I hope to see you next month with Elizabeth Hinton. And thanks again, Dan. This was great. Thank you.
So appreciate everyone listening in. Take care, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Take good care of yourselves. Don't let your guard down.